Jesus, I'm like a distant father. Where to begin with Generation Terrorists? Well, first of all, let's get the obvious out of the way, which is that it's too long, which is a shame because I think if they trimmed the fat, this would genuinely be up there for me as one of their best. God only knows why, despite having written songs which could serve as masterclasses in glam punk perfection, they also decided to put a song on which was literally a B-side from their first ever single, a cover, which, while enjoyable, is very much there and then gone, and a remix of a track which is already on the album later in the track listing. Why is the remix before the actual song? Guys, this is your debut album, not a compilation album. You can't just throw any old shit on there. This isn't Lipstick Traces. Still, I digress. Despite the occasional rigidity of the production, namely the stiffly programmed drums, the Manics' youthful energy is what carries this album through the storm. Almost every song, however structurally sloppy or melodically bland in areas, feels intentful when sung with chest by James Dean Bradfield, who, I should add, is in full force on this album. His creativity really shows through the fact that despite this LP being packed to the brim with guitar solos, not a single one feels arbitrary or generic and always serves to aid the song melodically. Also, I can't move on without saying this. Motorcycle Emptiness is genuinely my favourite song written by anyone ever. It stands head and shoulders above everything else on this album and I want it played at my funeral. While Gold Against the Soul is sufficiently glossier, tighter, and better performed than Generation Terrorists, unfortunately it still doesn't quite stick the landing for me. That being said, the production and comparatively fleeting runtimes are such that even lesser memorable tracks like Yourself, Druggy, and Symphony of Tourette are more forgiving on the ears, where in contrast nostalgic Pusshead and Gold Against the Soul essentially run out of ideas within their first 2 minutes and wear themselves paper thin not long thereafter. The same can't be said for this album's run of singles though, which are some of the best of the band's entire discography. Life Becoming a Landslide is a criminally underrated song which twists and turns at every opportunity, breathing new life into the song and culminating in something truly breathtaking by the end. What more can be said about this project that hasn't been said 1,000 times before? It's incredible, an unapologetic plunge into the deepest, darkest depths of Richie Edwards' troubled mind, and an album whose musical inflections reflect that of its lyrical themes for a change, culminating in a stern and merciless listening experience that paints the world we inhabit as inherently evil through disjointed chords, spiky guitar playing, hauntingly beautiful lyrics, and one of the most brooding vocal performances I've ever heard, all the while maintaining an air of catchiness and even occasional poppiness on tracks like Yes and Faster. It's a paradox that still boggles my mind as to how they pulled it off. My undying adoration for this band lies largely in their repeated unwillingness to convey their music through any other means than what feels right and truthful to them, and this album epitomises that for me, even at the cost of being commercial suicide. Go and listen if you haven't already, you'd be doing yourself a favour. I think regardless of how well it sold, the Holy Bible was only ever going to be a one-off phenomenon that could never be repeated, even by the band themselves, evidenced by the fact that Richie Edwards was present for the recording of some of this album. But still, to effectively alienate the diehards by releasing something this commercially accessible immediately afterwards is a bold move nonetheless, and incredibly on brand for the Manics. If I were to listen to every Manics album with no prior knowledge of the release dates, I would not in a million years assume this was the successor to the Holy Bible. Not to mention, it's incredible. It's such a joyous listen which favours melody and texture over aggression and volume, a trade-off which so eloquently showcases the Manics' versatility, proving them capable of breaking through to the mainstream while not compromising their lyrical content. Kevin Carter was a single for Christ's sake, and while undeniably catchy, still raises eyebrows upon researching the man in question. Not to mention Small Black Flowers That Grow in the Sky harkens heartbreakingly back to the Holy Bible's Holocaustian imagery, albeit repackaged in a far less post-punk leaning style. If you want an album whose anthems pile so high that I would argue there's something for everyone on it, give this one a try. I'm consistently surprised on repeated listens of this album by how comparatively downtrodden and depressive it is to Everything Must Go, especially considering this album was huge and the band probably knew it would be too. With that in mind, you'd assume this album continues the upward trajectory of brightness that Everything Must Go left behind, but no. And I'm not going to say the album suffers for it because this is yet another welcome change for me. It isn't without its misses, which I'll get to, but I think of this album as being Nicky Wire's version of the Holy Bible in that its introspectivity exhibits the bleakest areas of his brain, with the form very much meeting the function both musically and in terms of production. That being said, while this album isn't without its glimmers of hope, albeit instrumentally a majority of the time, its running order can leave you feeling exhausted and in dire need of an uplift that doesn't actually arrive until a few tracks later, by which point you're already experiencing album fatigue. And the songs themselves aren't bad necessarily, but when positioned back to back on the tracklist in this way, it can read as an overhaul of glumness. Not to mention, this album, in my opinion, is too long, an issue the Manics run into a few times throughout their career, albeit in a far less aggressive manner than on Generation Terrorists. Tracks like I'm Not Working and Be Natural read more as ideas that have yet to be fleshed out to the extent of the other more poppier tracks on this album, causing them to stick out rather awkwardly, particularly I'm Not Working, which frankly is a glorified soundscape whose bare-bones nature does not justify its runtime in any way. In my opinion, this album is where the Manics' tendency to surprise or alienate people with their releases goes wrong, as unlike their former projects, this one reads as having considerably less direction and more like just a bunch of songs that made up an album. Occasionally, when creative people decide to not give a fuck and release something with intent to polarize, they walk a fine line between masterpiece and dog shit, and while this album certainly isn't horrible, it definitely leans more toward dog shit than masterpiece. There's just nothing threading these songs together, not even the production, which fluctuates, albeit intentionally, from track to track in such a jarring way. So Why So Sad sounds awful, and it was a single somehow. Don't get me wrong, at the core of it is a song which I would consider single-worthy, but it's hard to see the wood for the trees when the Manics are doing everything in their power to make these songs sound as ramshackle as possible. I would go as far as to even call the songs themselves directionless sometimes. Tracks like Wattsville Blues and Baby Eliane present interesting ideas, but transition to and from their choruses in such an unnatural and ham-fisted way that makes it hard to cling to anything. Also, I'm a broken record, I know, but guys, this album does not warrant 16 tracks. His Last Painting and Epicenter go absolutely nowhere and offer so little of interest. Get rid. I don't get the hate for this album personally. It trumps Know Your Enemy for me on the account that we're at least back to thematic consistency from one track to the next. Not to mention, this album's production is lush, as is James Dean Bradfield's voice. To think this is the same guy who recorded vocals on Gold Against the Soul is mind-boggling considering how vastly different the two are in tone. I guess my main complaint would be that the album doesn't balance itself out particularly well. I get they were going for more of a lounge album vibe, but that can still be the vibe without it consuming the entire record. Put two more high-octane tracks in place of Emily and Fragments, for instance, and that'd make for a far more engaging and dynamic listen, as those tracks do lose me a little on the account that they read as lesser versions of something like 1985 or A Song for Departure. This album is so much fun, and it came at just the right time in their discography in my opinion. Manics fans were gagging for a return to the guitar-heavy, arena-sized sing-alongs at this point, and the band delivered on that promise successfully. That being said, there are a few moments on this where the authenticity of how the songs were formed warrant bringing into question. Some of Nicky Wire's lyrics on this album feel very try-hard to such a degree that there's almost no denying that they're intentionally not his best lyrics because he's just trying to appease the general listening public, which is a bit lazy considering they've proven in the past that they can achieve number one singles with lyrics that do mean something to them. Just look at If You Tolerate This, Your Children Will Be Next, or The Masses Against the Classes. Songs like Autumn Song and Underdog suffer from this issue the most, particularly the latter, whose closing lines are shockingly bad, which I think was done on purpose, but guys, come on, you're in your late 30s now, you should be well and truly past the days of writing edgy lyrics with the intention to shock. You're not Blink-182. Nicky isn't solely to blame for this though, as James's lead guitar on Autumn Song, as if I even need to say this, is blatantly aping Sweet Child of Mine. You can't get much more Radio X bait than that. It's borderline shameless, not to mention Indian Summer is just a counterfeit A Design for Life, which, despite borrowing elements from that song, comes nowhere close to it on any front. It all just feels a little desperate and spells midlife crisis in block capitals. This album reintroduces lyrics by Richie Edwards, and without even having researched it, you could probably tell that through James Dean Bradfield's eerie vocal presence and guitar playing, both of which conjure up the Holy Bible in ways no other album of theirs has come close to, nor even attempted. Tapping back into such a sound would require that the Manics really give it their all, and you know what? It pays the fuck off. This album is brilliant in the way that it clearly pays homage to the Holy Bible while somehow not coming off as a shallow imitation of it. Journal for Plague Lovers is a beast in its own right, and yet another shining example of the Manics not giving a damn. It's also remarkably brief, considering there are 13 tracks here, but aptly so. The Manics, particularly later down the road, don't always have the keenest ear for when a track has run its course, so it's refreshing to hear an album of short, sharp shocks. If anything, the length of the tracks aid the feeling of unease this album attempts to evoke with how sudden they are. It makes the listener feel as if they're being assaulted belted with every new song. A true masterwork, and one that I'm amazed arrived so late in their career. Unfortunately, this is the first Manics album where I hear nothing distinctly unique in these songs structurally. Most of them kind of meld into one in my mind, and only upon re-listens am I able to pick out the subtle differences, particularly the opening 5 tracks, which are a bombardment of shallow whimsy, some of which work, like in the case of the first 2, but beyond that just read as padding for time. Not to mention it only serves to exploit the fundamental tedium of a song itself when you have such grandiose production surrounding it, setting the listener up for something they think is going to be epic, which inevitably disappoints to varying degrees. I find myself once too often thinking, that's a good chorus, or that's a good bridge, as opposed to that's a good song. Tracks like All We Make Is Entertainment and Auto Intoxication are highlights for me on the album, but could never be singles on the account that they read as different ideas clumsily thrown together in the hopes for the best, which just doesn't make them pop in the way I think the Manics intended, even if there is an undeniable quality to each distinct section of said songs. I have a similar relationship with this album as I do Amnesiac by Radiohead, in that similarly to Amnesiac and Kid A, this album and Futurology were recorded in the same sessions, which begs the question of why they didn't just release Futurology and save the best tracks on here for future material, because while Futurology certainly stands up as an album in its own right, this, in my opinion, doesn't. I get that in contrast to Futurology they were going for a comparatively stripped back sound here, but the songs simply aren't there, and no amount of guest features or gospel choirs can save that, especially so when a majority of these songs are played almost solely acoustically, leaving no room for the listener to cling to anything other than the song at its core, which for the most part isn't doing anything all that interesting. This album isn't without its rays of sunshine though. Show Me the Wonder and I Miss the Tokyo Skyline, to name but 2, are beautiful songs and capture the nirvana I feel the lesser tracks on here fail to emulate. The year is 2014, and the Manics have nothing left to prove and are already sitting on a plethora of great music and can now sit back and, oh wait, here comes this absolute banger. Seriously, what is with this band? Why aren't they more widely regarded as one of the greats in Britain? I digress. Futurology is potentially one of the hardest left turns of this band's career up to this point, and sees great success in doing so. For James Dean Bradfield to be writing such inspired melodies as Divine Youth and The Next Jet to Leave Moscow this far down the road is one thing, but by God the production is so sweeping and at times breathtaking, such that you can't imagine these songs even at their core set to any other backdrop. The instrumentals on this project are killer too, and where on any other album would occupy the role of filler, here they stand toe to toe with the actual songs purely because they've just got so much going on at any given moment. I will say that Misguided Missile and The View from Stowe Hill could easily have been left off this though. Green Gartside does a fine job on the former, but is admittedly an odd choice of feature, seeing as he pretty much just sounds like James Dean Bradfield. Not to mention, while both of these tracks carry themselves well instrumentally, melodically they do stick out as bland on an otherwise rich album. Liverpool Revisited, more like Postcards from a Young Man Revisited. No, in all seriousness, for as much as this album is clearly another stab at mass communication, as Nicky Wire would put it, it definitely has more variety and overall highs than Postcards, which I would describe as consistently average throughout. That being said, such highs do make the lulls feel distinctly worse than your typical Manics LP, especially when in tracks like A Song for the Sadness and Vivian, all I can hear is James Dean Bradfield trying to capture lightning in a bottle and winding up with a little drizzle of rain instead. Even so, it still amazes me how International Blue, Hold Me Like a Heaven and Dylan and Caitlin could stand toe to toe with their classic hits, yet came out 20 years later. Manics, I get James Dean Bradfield's voice is like a wounded soldier by this point, but if that's the case, just release an album made wholly up of instrumentals, because James's inability to write interesting melodies anymore plagues this album through and through, to such a degree that I would rather he just filled those gaps with almost anything else. I mean, his guitar solos are still kinda cool, like on Diapause and Happy Bored Alone, but putting that aside, this was just a snooze fest from start to finish, and one that I can't even say attempted anything new or bold. It was just a Manics album written by AI. Okay, and now for the rankings, coming at you in 3, 2, 1. Well, thank you for watching everyone. Do leave a comment letting me know what you thought of this video as well as your own Manics rankings. I'm genuinely interested to hear what they are. And until next time, for real this time, Gorillas.